Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for turning out today for Judge Williams's talk on his book, The Reformer. My name is Jonathan Citron, and I'm pleased to introduce our panel. I want to start by thanking the Harvard Russian Law Students Association at the law school, who are co-sponsoring the events with the law school library. To be clear, that's the Harvard Russian Law Students Association rather than the Harvard Russian Law Students Association. And I also want to thank June Casey at the library for organizing our book talk series and bringing about this one in particular. Also want to thank the Harvard Coop for selling copies of the book in the back of the room, available there. And I believe Judge Williams is willing to sign the book as well for added value. And you can go there after the session for the signing. And also, big thanks to the Dean's office for providing lunch today. And so if you enjoy the lunch, feel free to have another, since there appears to be some modest surplus of lunches. Also note that this talk is being recorded, so the Russians are listening, along with anybody else who will tune in to the YouTube channel of the law school afterwards. So the Panopticon is present. Should you ask a question in particular, you may have that recorded for posterity. And with that, we should introduce our panel. First, Judge Stephen F. Williams, for whom I had the distinct honor and privilege of serving as a clerk, for which I fear my greatest contribution to Chambers was maintaining the aquarium, which had a number of minnows in it, which we named Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meager, and Flom. I think that's right.
The fish died almost immediately after Jonathan left.
Again, not exactly a legacy then, but at least something I helped with while I was there. Judge Williams graduated from Harvard Law School in 1961, practiced at Debevoise and Plimpton, and as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. Also served as a professor of law at the University of Colorado. Was appointed to the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit by President Reagan in 1986. Shortly thereafter, the wall fell, communism ended. I'm not saying the two were directly related, but should they be, I want to thank you for your service and impact there. And while a federal judge, Judge Williams has taken time to write scholarly works also accessible to the public. His first book on Russian history, Liberal Reform in an Illiberal Regime, The Creation of Private Property Rights in Russia, 1906 to 15, addressed an effort to enhance peasant property rights. You were working on that book while I was clerking, I remember. And
it was a gleam in the eye.
A gleam in the eye. You kept talking about Stolypin, which I thought was the subject of the book rather than a brand of vodka. But I could be wrong about that. Here is yet another book in Judge's oeuvre on that time in Russian history. Joshua Rubinstein, associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard, and the associate director for major gifts at Harvard Law School. Thank you very much for your service there. Also author of The Last Days of Stalin last year, for which there is a movie that is associated, if not directly caused by the book, and a review of the movie which mentions the book. So we should have had The Last Days of Stalin here as well with a twofer that you could buy, but it's probably too late to do that unless we... Oh, we had a book talk on it. Great. So this is one of a series. Perfect. So congratulations on that. We look forward, by the way, to the movie on The Reformer that will soon be coming out as well. Before joining Harvard, Josh was on the staff of Amnesty International USA as the Northeast Regional Director. We also have with us Alexis Perry, assistant professor of history at Boston University and author of The War Within, Diaries from the Siege of Leningrad. She focuses on the history of modern Russia and Eastern Europe, especially the Romanov and Soviet periods. So thank you so much for joining us. What an amazing brain trust to talk about these issues. Judge Williams, I'm going to turn it over to you to deliver some remarks for about maybe 30 minutes, and then the balance of time in a self-moderated panel will be from our respondents, and then, of course, questions from the audience. So thank you so much for writing this and giving us an opportunity to hear about it and to discuss it.
First, I want to say that with Professor Rubenstein here, I am envious of anyone who manages to have a title overlapping closely with a movie that's obviously going to be, is already a source of great excitement, and it's been denounced by Russia, and with any luck will be denounced by Trump. And if I had either of those, I'd be truly joyful. I have a feeling Trump certainly, and not even Putin, will take much interest in this. First, I want to talk about Melnikov's family and his youth, and then I'll plunge fairly directly into what I see as the challenge he set himself and the reasons why it was such an uphill battle. First, his family. He was born in 1869. His father was an ophthalmologist. He was both a researcher and a clinician in ophthalmology. He was also sort of a manager because he did his clinical work at the Moscow Eye Clinic, a building which still exists in Moscow as an eye clinic. And there were actually 3 levels of supervision above him, but it appears that under the Tsarist system, those positions went to people who weren't really expected to do any managing. It enabled them to have a good life, and that was enough. So the people lower down in the hierarchy had to do management. My point is that Melnikov, the father, pulled together a variety of things, sort of practical medicine, intellectual research, and practical management. So that's already a sort of broad sphere. His mother was very well educated and very religious, and I put those two in a package together because it appears to have been a fairly rare combination. And although Melnikov's father was by no means scornful of religion, it's quite clear that he was not at all religious himself, so that my Melnikov, growing up, was clearly exposed to radically different outlooks on the world, living, so far as appears, in complete harmony. And I think that plays a role in what goes on. I want to turn to his life at the university because that's important partly in terms, I think, the speculation of explaining why his brother Nikolai, who after all had the same family background, turns out to be so different, which I'll go into in a second. First, at the university, he established his reputation for eloquence. There was a dispute over how to apply the funds of a concert given by the student orchestra, whether it should go, as it historically had, to poor students at the university or to starving peasants, because this occurred right in the middle of the famine of 1891. The students taking different positions lined the sides of a hall, and when it came to Melnikov, who spoke in favor of devoting the proceeds to famine relief, the other side melted away, and it went seemingly by default to the side that Melnikov had taken. And he, I mean, his speeches were typically thereafter newsworthy. Another critical event during his university life was a trip to France in 1889, the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. First, he reports walking along a sidewalk, and someone thrusts an election campaign leaflet into his hand. And he's startled and even a little frightened because he doesn't adjust to the fact that this is all France, not Russia. Had it been Russia, it might have been, not the right thing. It might be contraband. But it gave him a strong sense of how different France was. And it gave him this idea that the people and the government don't have to be in extreme hostility, which would be a development from the Russia that he knew. His choices of majors put him on track to be a perpetual student. First, natural sciences. He lasted in that for 2 years. Then he switched to history, which he did extremely well in. And then, somewhat startlingly, after I think it's 4 years in history, he switches to law and gets his law degree in 9 months. So why the switch? And I think to explain the switch, you have to go back to his scrapes at the university. The scrapes, by modern standards, seem very, very mild. They were basically participation in demonstrations. On the other hand, we should note that his role in these demonstrations was somewhat in your face. At one point, when a bunch of students are gathered in some place, the police don't want them, he says, "We won't disperse till you clear out the police." The answer from the police is, "Grab him," and he was grabbed. Now, what are the consequences? That was just one episode. There were several. So what were the consequences? Well, one is that someone higher in the history department named Bogolepov said, it was not clear how Melnikov heard this. I don't know if it was said to him, "While I am here, Melnikov will not become a professor of history." And Melnikov took that seriously, even though a very distinguished history professor, Paul Vinogradov, was sort of grooming Melnikov to be, in fact, a professor of history, and urged him to disregard Bogolepov, but Melnikov was understandably nervous. Another consequence was that he received what was called a wolf's passport, which is a very strange name because it wasn't a passport to anything except oblivion. It essentially meant that until withdrawn, you could not go to the university at all. In a fairly short period of time, it was withdrawn, thanks to the influence of Melnikov's father with various people in the powers that be. But it's clear that despite the rescue, Melnikov's career was really in serious jeopardy as a result of these rather trivial things. So this leads me to return to the issue of his brother Nikolai. Here these people brought up in the same household, and I like to think that the diversity of opinion in the household led to the kind of open-mindedness that Melnikov continually displays. No such thing with brother Nikolai. At a time when Vasily Melnikov is defending people who are being charged with very vague crimes and highly questionable crimes in many ways by the Tsarist regime, brother Nikolai is orchestrating these prosecutions. The most extreme case is the Baylis trial, which involves a Jew who's had the misfortune to have a job at a brickyard, which was right next to a place where some murderers, there undoubtedly was a real murder here, had left the body of a child. And local anti-Semites had the bright idea that this could be turned into a blood libel trial with a Jew, and the nearest one on hand was Baylis, to be charged with having killed the child in order to get the blood for matzos. I'm quite fond of what a reporter got from a member of the jury about the three lawyers who defended Baylis. Karabchevsky, we didn't understand. Grusenberg, we didn't trust. Melnikov, he hit the nail on the head. But what was Nikolai doing? He was Minister of Internal Affairs. He was pushing the prosecution. He was doing such unsavory things as organizing the eavesdropping on the jury. So you have really radical difference in behavior. My theory, and it isn't it's, highly speculative, it is that Melnikov, my Melnikov, having been the target of government arbitrariness, was extremely sensitive to that and understandably devoted, in a sense, really devoted his career to moves which would bring that under control. Nikolai Melnikov seems to have not had that experience, perhaps because he was less uppity to begin with, but in any event, he didn't, and he settled in nicely to the role of a czarist enforcer. Before turning to the specific things about developing the rule of law and the obstacles, I want to quote the words of his cadet rival, Paul Melnikov, about Melnikov. And he described him as having a lawyer's professional habit of seeing a share of truth on the opposite side and a share of error on his own. Melnikov offered that clearly with disdain. And so Melnikov is the head of the the flagship liberal party in Russia at this time, and that's the way he expresses disdain for someone who has a capacity for recognizing error. I might a similar phrase, actually it's not so useful, comes from Trotsky saying that Melnikov was above all parties, which from Trotsky was intended, and I think completely understood, as a sneer. Now, I wanted to present the thought that in Russian history, the best opportunity for at least a serious breakthrough to the rule of law was the period 1905 to 1917, the period of Melnikov's principal activity. And you can divide that into two sub-periods. First, the period from the October Manifesto, which essentially commits the Tsar to an elected legislature, the Duma, whose laws are to be essentially constraining on the executive power. And the Duma is indeed elected. The franchise was a universal franchise, but you have to look carefully beyond that. Virtually all males could vote. Of course, the Brits at this time had certainly not adopted suffrage for women, so Russia was not way behind there. But the franchise was skewed so that workers and peasants had far less influence than their numbers would have led them to have on a clear one-man, one-vote approach. So the result, and then between the first two Dumas and the second two Dumas, you have an illegal cutting down of the franchise. So while the first two Dumas are extremely radical, the second two Dumas are quite conservative. So neither is probably perfect for working out progress toward the rule of law, but they at least represent institutions where reforms can be debated, could be debated, and baby steps taken. So then we have the February Revolution in February 1917, and the liberals essentially come to power, at least in terms of running the provisional government, which operates under all kinds of constraints, to be sure. But at any rate, they're in nominal charge. And they are nominally committed to the rule of law. Essentially, almost no progress is made in the period of the four Dumas, and I think it's fair to say, in terms of real rule of law, there's some reforms under the provisional government, but not really rule of law reforms. essentially, despite this comparatively good opportunity, not much happens. First, well, now, there you go. I'll skip that. Let me turn to the relationship between Melnikov's activities and the obstacles to the rule of law. And what I'll do is to try to talk about particular formal institutions that were defective or non-existent, and the sort of substratum, the informal relationships that fail to support reform, or perhaps, we put it more radically, undercut reform. I'll try to zip through this fairly quickly. My basic argument is that without civil society, the formal institutions supporting the rule of law are quite inadequate. And well, I can go further on that, but let me say that civil society seems to me the quintessence of bottom-up democracy, and without it, true democracy is really limited. Anyway, I'm going to whip through some things very quickly. First, judicial independence. On paper, it's great. The reform of Alexander II in 1864 protects judges against dismissal, transfer, demotion. Fine. How did it actually work out? The man who was Minister of Justice for most of this run-up from the October Manifesto to 1917 said that it was possible for him to bend judges to his will. And I think it's safe to infer that judges generally got the idea that the Minister of Justice had this capacity and trimmed accordingly. So that you have some things in words protecting judges, but in practice not. What about social attitudes? In the elite, you have Tolstoy, with certainly at the top of the literary elite, with a very dramatic view of the state, namely a view that all states are illegitimate. It's quite a strong view, and encapsulated with that, of course, the judiciary. The judiciary are worse because they purport to hide behind the law, but in fact they are just another form of violence. And so the states being illegitimate was part of a broader Tolstoyan notion that all violence was illegitimate. But when it's clothed, of course, with legal authority, it's particularly bad. What about peasants? They had very little exposure to law in any sense that we're familiar with, and they're quoted as having such sayings as, if all laws were eliminated, we could live justly. And in not having any rights under law, really, as a practical matter, that seems to me quite an understandable reaction. Remedies for official lawlessness were highly defective. I'm not sure if I can point to a particular social attitude that goes with that, but it doesn't seem to have stirred people up desperately. Third, centralization of state authority. Again, Alexander II made reforms, creating a kind of rural, local legislative body, the Zemstvos, and there was also an urban equivalent. But these operated, first they operated under restraints that make sense. They were local, and you don't want local bodies invading the neighborhoods with their rules. See the Negative Commerce Clause, etc., and also specific provisions in our Constitution. But in addition, the Ministry of Internal Affairs had supervisory power over the Zemstvos and their decisions, supervisory power that included a kind of discretionary branch, so that they, apart from other flaws, they were not really places where people got practice in negotiating legal resolutions subject to a legal framework and subject merely to a legal framework. It was all subject to this discretionary review. I want to say a special word about the peasants and the form of local government that they would have been most interested in would have been at the lowest level, a level where there was no local self-government at all. And the reason this would have been of particular concern to them was that it was through that, really, again, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, that so-called taxes in kind were applied. Taxes in kind was a nice word for what in France before the revolution was the corvée. In other words, work by peasants dragooned into road repair, bridge repair, and that sort of thing. Now, there was no such local legislative institution, and basically it was because the regime didn't trust the peasants. Well, the peasants had no practice at participating in what we'd like to think of as a local government body, or at least highly limited practice at that. So you can understand, and you have a circular problem. They're not trusted because they don't have experience. They don't have experience because they're not trusted. And it would have been better, of course, if more progress had been made on that. I think the last, no, two more things. Property. Property rights in the West have been seen as a basis for enabling people to have some independence of the government. The story in Russia is completely different. The people who had the best property rights, the so-called landowners, who don't include peasant rights, far from their land giving them independence, it was associated with their ownership of serfs, and the relationship with the Tsar, thanks to the serfs, was one of dependence of the landowners to help them keep the serfs in submission. So private property in Russia was really a symbol of dependence on the state rather than independence. Of course, for peasants who had been property did not have a very good name. There are a number of things which are covered in the cheat sheet that I think has been made available to you. I do want to point to the direct government barriers to associations, which Melnikov encountered. You recall we have the dispute over how to use the proceeds of the student concert. Oh, sir, you have all this money. You want to apply it to peasant relief. You need some sort of vehicle for doing that. Now, the government felt that that vehicle must be a government vehicle subject to government supervision all the way. A deal was worked out, which was probably okay, but the fact that there had to be a deal is typical and disconcerting. The upshot of this is that you have a country with little taste for institutions supporting the rule of law and little experience in institutions supporting the rule of law. And Melnikov liked to quote a line of poetry from the poet Nekrasov: "It's not easy to correct the work of centuries," but that, of course, was what he was trying to do. I'll say just one word about what seems to me to have gone, one of the things that you wouldn't expect or you wouldn't necessarily focus on as having set things off in the wrong direction in the whole period, 1905 to 1917. The liberals generally overplayed their hand. But that's slightly different from the question of the way they overplayed their hand. They directed themselves almost entirely to variants that relate to majoritarianism. Of course, it was something reasonable to fight for, but it's something on which they were sure to reach to encounter the maximum resistance. They devoted very little of their talent and energy and bargaining to things that would build the rule of law, things that would constrain government arbitrariness. I want to turn now, and this is my special homage to the results of the 2016 election. And I want to talk about Melnikov, his ability to use the rhetoric of moderation. And the first episode is in the fight over the field courts martial. This was a pretty ghastly system in which soldiers were essentially given the power to try people on charges of effectively treason, and soldiers who were not trained in the law at all. The probability of conviction was overwhelming. The result was hanging. This is what gave rise to the phrase Stolypin's neckties. And it was not a good system. Before you condemn it wholesale, bear in mind that terrorists were killing about 300 government officials a month during this time. So there was a need for something, although the field courts martial was probably not it. Anyway, Stolypin, defending it, took the view that the interests of protecting the state from the revolution sometimes required a sacrifice of private interests. Melnikov picked that argument up and turned it around, depicting the field courts martial as destructive not merely of private interests, but of the state itself. And he anticipates the words that Robert Bolt puts into the mouth of Sir Thomas More in A Man for All Seasons. Striking at the revolution, you have not struck private interests, but you have struck all that protects us, the courts and lawfulness. If you defeat the revolution this way, you will at the same time defeat the state, and in the collapse of revolution, you will find not a rule of law state, but only solitary individuals, a chaos of state breakdown, which of course describes what happens ultimately in 1917. I think the key to the argument is that it recognizes Stolypin's hope that the Russian state would become not only an object of respect, but an object of deserved respect. And so he tried to show him that the field courts martial were destructive of a central goal that Stolypin had. He takes a goal of the adversary, a goal that Melnikov shared, and uses it to bring the adversary around. Of the speeches given attacking the field courts martial, Melnikov's was the only one to which Stolypin replied directly. I think I've now gone a half hour. I have some other episodes. I'll jump quickly to one involving Kerensky, who, if you want to think of the person most irritating to debate on any subject, I think Kerensky would be my nominee. Anyway, in a debate on a bill that Melnikov was promoting, Kerensky pointed out correctly that the bill was in fact represented evolution from something Stolypin had done in 1906. That was true. It was, incidentally, something that Stolypin had done that Kerensky acknowledged as being progress. The Tsarist regime in 1916 offered a bill that would turn this decree, the Stolypin decree, into a real law, and in the course of doing that, it also had measures slightly, at the margin, enhancing it. It went to a committee of the Duma, and Melnikov was the reporter for that committee. He took the process slightly farther, again with improvements, not radical, but enabling progress. Kerensky keeps going back to the fact that this all starts with Stolypin. And Stolypin, for the left, was simply the devil incarnate. So there were two things are being sort of implied. One is, well, this reform can't be any good. It derives from Stolypin. And Melnikov, who is pushing this reform, can't be any good. He's just a sort of mini Stolypin. And so this is all innuendo, very, very hard to get at. And Melnikov replies very mildly, correcting clear misstatements by Kerensky. But he says this: he opposed Stolypin when he thought he was wrong, supported him when he thought he was right, as in the decree being debated. For me to recognize when my opponent is right, to recognize the deserts of my political foe, is a duty of political honor, and I've here fulfilled it. I think he felt he had a very strong sense of duty in that sense. And I did want to say this. I'll close by saying, when I started this project, I had an inclination that I would grow to like Melnikov, and I did. I had not much opinion about Kerensky. I knew in a vague way what he had done. I found by the end of it, I won't speak of it in terms of dislike. I found myself in wonder that the constitutional Democrats could have advanced his role so much that, in effect, he takes over the provisional government in 1917. That seems to me if you'd been in that debate, how you could have allowed that to happen, I can't fathom. So thank you, and I look forward to comments.
Thank you, Judge Williams. Before I go into the book, and I think before Alexis and I get into specifics about the book, we were both curious as to how you became a student of Russian history, in addition to your distinguished career as a jurist. So if you would just share with us for a moment how you came to write about Russian history.
Well, you know, you hear of red diaper babies. I was a Cold War baby. My family took a dim view of the Soviet Union. And I remember, I mean, a particular very memorable aspect of it was there was a family friend who was a British journalist woman who had married a Russian who came to London as part of some trade delegation. Then they moved back to Moscow and had a child. And in 1937, the knock came on the door, and her husband was spirited away. Actually, they later were able to find out that he died in the Gulag. Well, that was no surprise. But he died attempting to bring about a rebellion in the Gulag. Clearly a man able to fight even though the odds were a zillion to one against any success. Anyway, so when the Soviet Union collapsed, it occurred to me that the pre-Soviet regime might be an interesting source of knowledge about what would happen next. And so I looked around for something to study, and I lit upon, probably not surprisingly, the Stolypin reforms trying to create private property rights. Then as I was reading the proofs for that, I thought, gosh, this is awfully wonky. Maybe I can make the period more fun by writing a biography.
So you had Russian language.
Ah! Not at the beginning. No. I saw Richard Pipes at some event, and I asked him, is there a good biography of Stolypin in English? And he said, no, there really isn't. So not being as good at follow-up questions as I should have been, I thought, well, all I have to do is learn Russian, and then I'll get to a good biography of Stolypin. So I worked away, taking lessons in a great but unknown American university, the Department of Agriculture in Washington. And I came to a point where I thought I would be able to read a biography of Stolypin if it existed. And I saw him again, and I asked him, so, what Russian language biographies of Stolypin are worth my reading? He said, well, there really aren't any. So clearly I had to broaden my focus.
Well, good for you. So let me begin with a specific question. From the book and your remarks today, it's clear that Melnikov deserves a great deal of respect for attempting to preempt what happened. This violent revolution, this violent takeover by the most extreme party in Russia of the day, the Bolsheviks. And seeing that on the horizon, he was looking to push both rule of law and moderating forces to create institutions that didn't exist because of the autocracy. So my question is, as I was reading the book and reading his efforts to give this speech and that speech, propose this law and that law, while the Tsar was still in power, in the framework of this parliament, the Duma, that had been established in the wake of the 1905 revolution, did it ever occur to you that Melnikov was essentially naive? That as well-meaning as he was, as determined as he was essentially naive as to what his prospects were and what the prospects were for Russia in general?
Well, like the old exchange, how's your wife, answer, compared to what? What were his alternative avenues? He thought these moves were good, whatever happened. What alternatives would someone have? And the other principal alternative, I think it's fair to say, was that being pursued largely by his own party, which, although gave lip service to the rule of law, really didn't focus on it at all, and kept, I mean, talk about batting heads against the wall. They batted their heads against the wall of the regime with a strong majoritarian claim. They were never going to succeed, short of some sort of revolution. His agenda had, possibilities of progress, as I think is manifested by, for example, the fact that you have the regime itself proposing these extensions, modest to be sure, of Stolypin's original 1906 decree. I'm talking about the one on peasant rights and eliminating or diminishing the effect of the estate. So, what do you do in these circumstances? I think he took, as short of emigration, he took the most practical approach available.
Well, I'll just make one more comment before we turn to Alexis, but when you look at, there are really two periods you're looking at closely. The period of the Duma, the establishment of the Duma in the wake of the 1905 revolution, to the Tsar's abdication in February 1917, and then this brief period of more democratic government without the Tsar under the short-lived, tragic provisional government. So one could say that the Duma was ineffective while the Tsar was in power, and the provisional government was ineffective after the Tsar lost power. And that in both settings, Melnikov was doing his best to try to move things forward in this kind of vacuum of proper institutions.
Yes.
And respect for the law.
Yes. Yes.
So to think of him, I'm not criticizing him as naive, but Don Quixote is a heroic figure. But in the end, Lenin picked up the cards.
Yes. One of the things which I do talk about in the book is the question of the Duma after the February Revolution. The provisional government, Kerensky most dramatically, took the view that nothing should be done with the Duma. It should be completely ignored. Melnikov thought that it could be used, that it was an institution where things could be debated. Now, I mentioned that the last two Dumas were highly conservative, but there was to call it a practice, maybe overstating it, but there was at least a concept in Russia that when an institution was short of personnel, you could fill in from previous holders of those offices. So that one thing that was talked about in this period was to bring back all the members of any of the 4 Dumas, including the ones from the 2 original radical Dumas, which would have created really quite a mixed group.
Right.
Kerensky would have nothing to do with that. And it's fair to say also that the Melnikov's colleagues in the Constitutional Democratic Party would have nothing to do with it. So that I should say that the Constitutional Democratic Party scoffed constantly at the reforms embedded in the October Manifesto and the laws which were adopted to implement it. They called it a fake constitution. But as soon as they come to power, they eliminate any constitution altogether, fake, whatever, and simply are content to rule as a committee in charge of things.
Yeah.
And the very specific problem, I think if they'd pulled together that sort of massive Duma collecting from all 4, it could have been a place where war policy could have been debated. And I'm not saying there was any good solution. My own conclusion is that Lenin had it right. The solution was to give up and get out. Whether they could have arrived at that by some means of discussion, I don't know. But at least they could have tried.
Right.
I wanted to convey a 9-minute warning. Suggested Alexis jump in.
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. I have 2 questions that I really wanted to ask, but I'll leave it up to you to decide what we have time to, what you want to respond to, given the time constraints. Thank you very much for this work and for being here today, sharing your work with us. It is a great example of the combination of careful research and compelling storytelling and a good deal of wit in the book as well. You begin in the book by asking why Melnikov, especially because he was not very successful ultimately, and you first give kind of a modest answer to that question. You say, quote, Melnikov is an inviting lens through which to view the last years of Tsarism. But then you make it more provocative, I think, and I think your cheat sheet does as well with this subtitle, A Missed Opportunity. And you add, quote, Melnikov's arguments delineate a Russia that might have been liberal, open, welcoming previously unheard voices, and defending institutions that could have been channeled into lawful paths. So I wanted to ask you, is might have been a claim about the viability of gradual reform instead of revolution, or is it just a useful turn of phrase for you? And that's what I mean by that, is that my reading of The Reformer is that it is part biography and part thought experiment. That liberalism could have taken root, perhaps, in Russia, if Melnikov's arguments carried more favor with his party, the cadets, if the Duma had had more time. You say towards the end of the book that they were learning to be an effective legislature. If the First World War had not interrupted progress, you give lots of ifs, raise a number of ifs and moments where things might have gone differently to prevent the violent socialist revolution. So I'd love for you to comment directly on this. Like, what is at stake in your story? Again, The Reformer seems premised on this claim that liberalism could have worked, but then when I got to the coda at the end of the book, you give a much more sort of skeptical outlook on that possibility and on the rule of law in general. So I'm wondering if you could sort of wed the coda more closely to your narrative of Melnikov's exploits and weigh in. Did Melnikov really represent a viable alternative path for Russia, a Russia that truly might have been? Is this an argument for contingency or for long-term historical causes? Another way to rephrase my question is, how important is the 1905 moment as opposed to these long-term social, economic, and political transformations of the Russian Empire? How important is the 1905 moment in causing the revolution?
Okay, I mean, that's a really good question. And how important? I think, and whenever I talk with historians who are particularly focused on this period, and they compare it to present-day Russia, they find the conditions, let me put it that way, political conditions in this period far better than today, obviously far better than the period of the Soviet Union in terms of developing anything like liberal democracy. So, say that the best period for development of liberal democracy in Russia, I would definitely nominate and claim that 05 to 17 was it. And you can reply, well, the best is none too good, and I can't deny that. But I guess it's a way of focusing, I think, on things you might look for. I mean, suppose it seems totally improbable now, but suppose a reformer should come to power in today's Russia. What would you look for that person to be doing? And I think it sort of gives you a set of subjects. I want to say something about, you've probably been to it, the museum in Moscow memorial, which had, at least when I went through it, had these poster boards with the lives of various dissidents, and I think it goes from the death of Stalin on to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you read these stories, and these guys, they do something that seems utterly harmless. They get arrested. They're sent to jail for 5 years. They get out. What do? They start again. And that's the story repeated endlessly, time after time, with these people. So that I guess the optimist in me perceives in Russians a sort of dogged willingness to take what seem to be dramatic risks in the interests of making serious progress. And I see Melnikov in a much gentler way fitting into that.
Well, I have more questions, but perhaps we should open it up to the audience since time is short. Really? Oh, okay. Well, I'll ask my question. Okay. You don't have to answer. You can answer me later. So I'm someone who works on personal documents quite a lot. I also find them really fascinating and confounding and demanding very careful analysis. And I was hoping you could speak a little bit about your method in approaching the memoirs and the memoir histories that you use in this book. The footnote suggests that you rely on them rather heavily, but also but not uncritically. You make comments several times that Maklakov's memoirs, that there are places where he shades the truth, I believe you say, or that he adjusts history slightly. But you do also defend him that he's not, I think your phrase is Monday morning quarterbacking on his participation and on the participation of the cadets in this reformist period. So if you could speak a little bit about how you approach such complicated accounts where he has a tremendous personal investment in shaping the narrative of the past, but yet also is very much committed to being judicious in his representation. I'm curious not just how you sort of parsed the facts from these accounts, but also what you did with the kinds of subjective truths you found, particularly in understanding Maklakov's sort of assumptive world, both his insights and his errors.
Well, yeah, no. Melnikov says in a letter to Ariadna Tyrkova-Williams that his focus in, I think he's speaking of at least 2 of his major books on the subject. His focus is to show that it wasn't simply bad regime, noble liberals challenging it. And since everybody knows bad regime, his discussion focuses on what he thinks were the bad steps made by the liberals. Now, to the extent that he attacked the bad moves by his constitutional democratic colleagues contemporaneously, that obviously strengthens the critique. But the question in the end is whether the strategies adopted by his fellow party members were sound strategies. And I think on that, you can look at it objectively, and I think say they were not. I mean, I quoted that passage from Melnikov, head of his party, essentially saying the trouble with Melnikov is that he sees a bit of truth in his adversary's side and a bit of error in his own. If those are faults, if those are seen as faults by the head of the party, we're in serious trouble. And in talking about here, I didn't go into what seemed to me the absolutely lunatic aspects of some of the constitutional democratic approaches. So that I think even if at worst, I would say that he steps up his criticism really of the period 1906 to sometime in 1907. He steps that up above the level that he was voicing then. But I don't think you find cases after 1907 where there's really any contradiction.
Mm-hmm. I realize we're at time. I just want to thank all three of you for introducing those of us who are neophytes to this incredibly rich tapestry of events and people and perhaps coulds have been. And for those of us who may be in the area to deepen our understanding of it, I just wish there were more time to delve even deeper into it. So I'd like all of you to please join me in thanking our three